at Pearson Education and a little bit of time at HarperCollins as well. So I spent most of my time on the trade side of the publishing industry.
Oh, okay. My name is Léonicka Valcius. I work at Scholastic Book Fairs. I've been there almost 2 years. I do the French book buying there. Before that, I interned at HarperCollins, and I also interned at the Rights Factory. And I've been talking about and writing about diversity in publishing since I started publishing school, really. It was just sort of the first thing that hit me walking through the door, and it was like kind of, oh, okay, so this is a thing. Why? And so that's how the conversation has evolved ever since. I don't ever claim to have all the answers. I'm very much, I like having conversations that lead to solutions. I think we can talk about things all the time, and I think as artsy people, we do like to talk about things that are important to us, but sometimes we need to be like, okay, so what? Now what are we going to do about it?
Yeah,
so I think that's what we're going to try to do in this really short time.
I hope everyone's ready to solve the
yes,
inequality.
Yes, we're going to solve the problem in 45
in the next 45
minutes. Okay, so I'll have you kick it off.
Okay. Well, in discussing how we want to do this, we've got a little bit of a sort of baseline framework that we want to establish. It's going to possibly upset some of you, I hope not too badly. But we did want to say that we start to talk about diversity in our industry, and we feel that it's the starting point is one of, if not outright white supremacy, then at least white normativity. If not homophobia, then at least heteronormativity, and if not patriarchy, then at least a lot heavily tilted to the male. So we definitely want that to be in. That's definitely at the front and center of our thought process as we start to address diversity in our industry. We also, certainly I am, I don't know if we got this to the end of this conversation, but I'm also very critical of mainstream multiculturalism when I think about diversity in general and certainly in our industry. I feel, or I'm afraid that it's become more of a way of managing minority issues. So what do I mean by that? I mean, as a country, we just finished celebrating Joseph Boyden in Canada Reads, the book that's going to change the country. But I'm very skeptical that that event, that celebration, will actually translate to political discourse. So in that way, I see multiculturalism as pushing a lot of voices from marginalized communities into the realm strictly of culture as almost a way of ignoring the political. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we talk about diversity, we're talking about a political issue of equity. My other favorite example is one of my favorite authors, Lawrence Hill. Everyone read the Book of Negroes, and it was a great bit of culture and art, but we still now, 5, 6, 7 years later, the country has done virtually nothing, I'll say nothing, to address the grievances of the African community in Canada. So we don't want to just be, although we are part of a cultural industry, we don't want equality issues and diversity issues to remain solely in that realm.
So I think that brings up a lot of issues. I think we have to realize that the lack of diversity, when we talk about diversity, we're talking about equity, really. And diversity is just the easiest way for us to measure that. But what we're really talking about is moving towards a publishing industry and a literary community that values marginalized people at all levels. So when we say that the industry is not in a petri dish, we don't exist outside of our other experiences. So we have to recognize that the things that are happening within the industry are part of the larger societal issues, and understand that it's not just us as an industry. That being said, we also have to understand that publishing is in the business of creating and sharing art. And the arts have been historically the space where subversive and controversial and real transformative change takes place. So I think while we understand that we're in this system, we have great power as people in the arts to change that same system. As for multiculturalism, I think one of my biggest challenges when talking about and answering questions about diversity in Canadian literature is the response, do we really have that problem? And I'm always baffled and trying to understand and explain that, because I feel like if you're asking me if this is a problem, then I can't help you. Like, there is this idea that we tell, this story that we tell ourselves about Canada, how we're nice and progressive and multicultural and accepting and embracing. And all these things are true at some level, but we need to go beyond that superficial layer and go on to say, how do our policies reflect that? How do the opportunities reflect that? How does the discrepancies between the rich and poor, between people of color and white people, between, you know, queer people and people who are straight or in other ways part of a dominant culture, and understand how their lived experience does differ from that of other Canadians. So once we dispel that notion that Canada has already fixed the problem, that Canada has already moved past all those things that Americans are still dealing with, when we get past that, we can actually start fixing things.
That issue always reminds me of one of the running gags on the Colbert Report, where he says, people tell me I'm white and I believe them because I vote Republican, or, but, you know, there's variations on it, and that's one of the things that I think a lot of people of color or from marginalized groups experience, is a very well-meaning sort of progressive attitude that, oh, I'm colorblind, and I don't play that game, because I think that you know, race still has, although it may not have a biological basis, it definitely has a major social impact, and so we're not approaching the topic of diversity from sort of let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya and be colorblind, because I don't believe that there's any such thing. So with that sort of framework established, does anyone have anything to, before we bash on, does anyone want to leap in and take us to task, or point out any things that we've missed, or?
This is going to be a discussion.
We hope, anyway.
Because I love to hear myself speak. However, yes.
I'm curious, where do you guys go to find out about other people of color writing in Canada? Because I find that when, like, I'm a bookseller, but I find that Canadian literature is so dominantly white and heterosexual that I'm not able to identify with it at all. As a Middle Eastern woman, I don't see any like Middle Eastern voices, and I think there are so many of us in Canada writing, and so can you give us some examples of where do you find out about writers? Because I find that 99% of reviews are the same writers, reviewers are the same people, and there's just such that, I feel like that is a big problem in terms of the lack of diversity, so we're not really promoting writers of color. And I make a point of only hand-selling writers of color, but there's only so many customers who want to read those things. So where do you guys personally look? Like, how do you find out about good books?
Do you want to maybe hold that one and then get this question and answer both?
Yeah.
Okay.
I actually kind of can speak to
Sure,
that.
please.
I interned at the South Asian Review, and they do actually a lot of niche publishing of that type. They publish Caribbean, Middle Eastern, not just writers from here though. They look in those countries specifically. But what I found when I was helping them with their marketing is they only were trying to sell to professors, because a lot of university classes tend to deal with that stuff, and that's where they sell, and that's usually the best places to find out about these authors, going specifically to those types of classes and finding out what they're reading.
I was going to mention TSAR. I used to sell their books when I was at the LPG. Do you want to answer the question?
For sure, I'll say, just make a few comments on that. I think that's a huge thing you touched upon. You, being a writer, being somebody who's interested in books, felt isolated in some sense. While there's TSAR doing exactly the type of stuff you're looking for. What I've found is that there's a lot of pockets within Canada doing a lot of fantastic work, and there's not a lot of connecting of it. So there's Ricepaper in Vancouver, I believe, and they have been a fantastic source of literary review and also publication of short stories and writing of Asian Canadian people. But there's not a lot of sharing. So I think that's a great point and something to work towards, more sharing. I find the online has been my source, and since January I've been doing the diverse CanLit chats, which has cropped up a lot of people who's like, wow, that's happening, I had no idea. And so that's an important facet of finding each other. Another thing is the word niche. I know why you use it, and you use it in exactly the way everybody else uses it, but the idea that South Asian Canadians writing about their experience is niche is problematic. Because if they are Canadian, why is it also considered CanLit? And if they are writing about their experiences in Canada or their experiences elsewhere, it should be broadly shared, broadly marketed, broadly sold. So I think we need to break out of the idea that writing about or by marginalized people and groups is niche.
Yeah. Well, this speaks into the issue of the sort of, in my more sort of politically fervent moments, I'll call it white supremacy, but if I want to tame it down a little bit, I'll say white normativity. There's nothing un-Canadian about someone of a certain pigmentation writing about their experience. To answer your question, from my side of things, I often look abroad. Bloomsbury Press, independent press in the US, just published an anthology of young African writers. Norton, every now and then, W.W. Norton will have a nice little collection of either something that's gone into print and it's been ignored by the mainstream, but like Harlem Renaissance writers and people inspired by that. But I would say that the real problem is that we, as people speaking from the margins, lack organization. I know in the trade union movement, there's always sort of the Black Caucus or the African Caucus and whatever union it is, whether it's the steelworkers. There's nothing like that in publishing to actually sort of give us a place to sort of come to find each other and to see what's doing.
I sort of agree with what you're saying. Like, if you, sorry to interrupt you guys, I don't want to take over at all. I'm just, it's interesting that you brought up like in the U.S. because I think in the U.S. there's definitely, there were movements like the Harlem Renaissance, and people are still looking at that and wanting to read those writers because they were so important. I don't know why it is that in Canada we don't have that. You know, we're still looking abroad, and I'm not saying that I don't want to read writers from overseas because I read a lot of writers that are Canadian, but I'm sort of curious why it's so difficult as even as someone who works in the industry to find like writers of color who are Canadian who are not forced into a niche. You know, like I'm sort of tired of it being the same story about a Middle Eastern woman, you know, like, you know, as being oppressed by her family and blah, 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 you know, and it's always the same sort of story, and it's very Orientalist. And like you were saying, like, it's very much like the white experience is normalized. I'd love to see the Black experience normalized and every sort of background just being a normal, like the norm. Like, here's a book, here's not just a Black book, or here's a book by a Japanese writer, you know, it's like, here's a book, happens to be by a Japanese person, you know, or whatever, you know.
Do you want to speak?
A little bit. I think like part of the problem is in Canada our literature is young, right? Like we as a country only really started taking real steps to encouraging like a nationalist ideation of what literature is in like the 70s. So we couldn't have like the Harlem School because we just weren't doing it, that sort of thing. But by the same token, I share your frustration, where it seems like sometimes there is the nichification of writers of color means that there is an acceptance of certain kinds of stories that can be told instead of stuff like what Pashamala does, where he's like, yes, I'm a brown guy, but I write about what I want to write about. I don't necessarily write about the like immigrant experience, or I don't necessarily write about these sorts of things. That I find is a really frustrating thing. And when you brought up Ricepaper, I thought about that's a great example of a publication that is striving to make a better space and a bigger space they're great, right? And I think that Leonicka hits the nail on the head, where the problem is that partially because our country is so big, and partially because our literature is still relatively new and in development, we don't have the kinds of connections that can make this very serious concern something that is more easily addressed on the art level. And then when you tie that to like the back end, more business stuff, the people that are making decisions in our country are Upper Canada College graduates who are white. And they're, Upper Canada College is a men's school. So like, that kind of thing, it's difficult, and there's no one easy answer, but at the same time, like the point about bringing connections, and especially with the advent of online stuff, it does become a lot easier to kind of start to pinpoint stuff, and you've done a lot of really great work with the diverse CanLit chat. I just wanted to like add that as a little bit of context.
I think one thing that's important and is I think you're absolutely right that our literature is young, and also we're big, but the U.S. is also big. It has the benefit of scale. Like, more people are in the United States, and there's more avenues to churn things out, and I think more people know to turn to the United States. And so I've been specifically trying to focus on Canada, because I know where to find Black people in the U.S., right? I know where to look if I want to read, Black women writers from the U.S., but I need to look for that a little bit deeper in Canada. And I think part of that is, but it's not just the books, and I think moving forward, it's to look at how can we change it starting from the ground up. So part of what we discussed when preparing for this is saying, so what kind of diversity will make a change? Is it just, okay, so let's publish more books by X type of people, let's publish more books about X people, or is there something different that we need to do?
Well, yeah, one of the in a sort of chicken and egg kind of scenario, is it the lack of diverse staff, or is it, does the lack of diversity on the staff level result in the lack of diverse output, or does the lack of diverse output act as a barrier to entry for diverse staff? I think it's probably a little bit of both, but I actually feel like when we look at the sort of institutional arrangements, we've got, 4 or 5 big corporate publishers and a hockey sock full of independent publishers. And I know in this kind of audience it would be probably easy for me to sort of rail on the big ones and get a round of applause, but I think when we were discussing this, I think we're both critical of the larger publishers for the lack of attention that they pay to diversity in CanLit. For example, I've been at Penguin for 2 years, and in the time that I've been at Penguin, we haven't published a single African Canadian novelist. There was one who was published just before I started. So, I mean, that to me is pretty stunning. It's one of the biggest publishing houses in the country, and kids list, adult list, not a single Black Canadian apparently had a story worth telling. And that's not to say that I think the editors I work with are fine people, but it's just not a priority. And one of the reasons that, as I try to think through this problem, is why would all these nice progressive people be participating in what really amounts to a literary apartheid? And the reason I have to, the conclusion I come to is that on the corporate side of things, there's an increasing risk aversion. It's seen as risky to publish minority voice. What if the sail-through isn't there? What if it turns out that white people in Canada really don't want to read about a little black child? What if they won't buy the book for their white children? And so we're just not going to touch it because it's too, it won't pay, it won't pay out. There is a lot more pressure on the big publishers who have shareholders to placate, and more pressure to make sure that every book pays for itself. And so they're kind of shying away. But now, when I said, like, I'm going to go in guns blazing at the big ones. And then I thought, when I worked at the LPG, with only a couple exceptions who tended to be very specialized, it's not like the small presses were doing much more, right? I mean, I think of TSAR, I think of Insomniac has a special interest in African Canadian literature and nonfiction, and there's a few presses that have a focus on native literature, but it's not like the sort of all of our favorite small Canadian presses. They're not exactly swimming with diversity either. So we wanted to save a little bit of our criticism for, and actually one reason why I'd be a little bit more critical is at least I can understand why the corporate presses are the way they are. My expectations for them are so low when it comes to prioritizing this sort of thing, because they're driven entirely by profit motive, or the balance at least is not what it used to be, I'll say. Whereas the small presses often have a lot more flexibility in what they can take a chance on, and they're not doing it. So.
To that point, I think what I'd like to emphasize, and then we'll throw it back out to y'all, is how much of a people business publishing is, and how the system, I feel that the streams themselves are not broke. Like the process itself, I don't feel is broken, and maybe y'all can disagree with me, but you submit a manuscript, somebody says yes or no for various reasons. They do all the things that it takes to publish a manuscript, which takes a lot, and then they try to sell it, and they try to sell it to as many people as possible. I think what changes in that is all those people involved within that process, and all the biases and preconceptions and they take within that. So when you're sitting around a sales conference, I have that on the mind, and saying, how are we going to sell this book? All those people with those preconceptions, and who they believe the audience is, and how they believe they can appeal to that audience, and what they believe the book to be about, and who they believe the book will appeal to, all these things that people are invested in then create that output.